What's beyond the backrooms? I mean that in both a spatial sense, a psychological one, and a temporal one. What lies behind those walls? How does it relate to our perception of horror? And what's going to be the next big thing that follows? In all senses, where do we go from here? It might sound like an inane question, but bear with me here. I think that this giant phenomenon of the backrooms and, in general, our big fascination with liminal spaces create a very interesting lens through which we can analyze the evolution of horror media and, more broadly, of how that which scares us has evolved through time. At the risk of spoiling this whole video and dumbing down my reasoning, I'll try to give you the gist right now. What used to scare people in the past is usually not too effective today. Duh. There are many reasons for this. Two big ones I'll be discussing are the evolution of technology, and in this sense also the way that the media we consume becomes increasingly more immersive, but also just the fact that some things stop being spooky as culture historically changes. Just think about something like superstition. Two very wide and relatively recent approaches we can identify in horror that have evolved in order to adapt to the times and to our changing tastes are the striving for the exploration of what I'll call the absolute exterior and the absolute interior, which in this video will respectively mainly be represented by outer space and our own human psyche. It's in this context that the backrooms and liminal spaces in general become very fascinating to me. We could say that spaces may be the most hostile, well, space for humans, and it's freaking everywhere out there. Our psyche, on the other hand, is only human and is confined to our tiny brains. Pretty easy, right? Well, then where do the backrooms fall in this little scheme? To me, they seem to stand somehow aside. We can't really point to their physical location because they're out of bounds from reality, and while they do seem to be infinite and somewhat hostile to humans, they are usually constructed of or filled with recognizable human-made things and materials. It's when I realized this that I had a sort of eureka moment and became convinced of the fact that this whole trend is not just a fad, but instead a new frontier in horror on many levels, even though today it might feel oversaturated. But we'll also touch on that. It also led me to the next rational question. What comes after this? After exploring so much of the external, internal, and aside horror, that's a working name, what could be the next iteration? Well, it might already be here, and for me, it could have something to do with artificial intelligence. So if you want to hear the pretentious, long-winded, and sidetrack-ridden version of this, please enjoy the rest of the video. Everybody knows about the backrooms at this point, the incredibly simple concept imagined by a random guy on the chan in a short post that describes the idea of clipping out of reality. Most of you probably also know what clipping means, but in short, for those that don't, it's a term used in reference to something you can do in video games, for which the player can force their way out of the designated explorable game world. This usually leads either to a dark void or to rooms and areas that were either scrapped from the game or never finished, which usually appear empty and uncanny. This is obviously because the players weren't meant to see them, at least in most cases. So, this anonymous poster quite simply applied the same concept to our own reality, and it spread like wildfire. The backrooms took the internet by storm, especially the horror sphere, thanks in no small part to Camepixel's great YouTube series. It grew to the point that it kinda got already old for many. People started making up new areas or levels, adding lore details, spooky creatures, and generally expanding ad infinitum that super basic starting concept. This organized expansion, if we can call it that, partly ruined the fun for me and many others, by taking something away from the mystery. I find Kane to still be among the few creators that managed to really utilize the concept to its full potential without making it too predictable. I think that the over-reliance on creatures of many series and games about the backrooms is especially detrimental, because it shifts the horror factor from the uncanniness of the spaces themselves and that dizzying swing between familiar and alien to the usual "oh, spooky monster gonna kill you." Sure, it's not like you can't use the creatures well, in fact Kane himself does it, but I think the series works in spite of that, not thanks to it. I just generally feel like the absence of an imminent danger is, for me, part of what can make the backrooms such an effective horror setting. My inspiration for this video mainly came from a few games that I saw IGP play, who made me want to go and experience them for myself, in particular Pools and Liminalcore. One of the main things that I found fascinating in these games is that, spoilers, they contain no immediate threat for the player. They're more so just walking simulators that rely on exploration. And this style is perfect for the backrooms, in my opinion. We'll talk about these examples later. For now, I want to focus on the mental rabbit hole they sent me into. While I was playing them, I was constantly amazed at what was shown on the screen, and I started to really ponder the question of what makes them so fascinating from a horror standpoint and why this whole backroom phenomenon became so popular. So let's dive a bit deeper and ask ourselves how we got here. What's changed in our perception of horror throughout time? And what role does the ever-growing presence of video games and the internet have on it? Remember back in the good old times of late
18th
century Europe, when people used to go to phantasmagoria shows and absolutely poop their pantaloons seeing projections of mysterious ghost nuns, farting demons, and, oh lord, everything but Napoleon? And what in the actual heck is even going on here? Can I even show this? Oh, I definitely can show that. Anyway, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you never had a childhood. But you might remember when during the 2000s, we all used to collectively skid our spanks when seeing a terribly fake 3D animation of an alien on some B-tier mystery show or on YouTube, thinking, oh my god, is this real? And you'd always have experts on those shows analyzing the footage, being like, well, according to our absolutely believable opinion, the answer here seems inconclusive. If it's fake, it's very well made. Really now? And don't get me started on grainy videos of UFOs, which for some reason were always filmed by people with extreme cases of Parkinson's. But nowadays, skepticism and disillusion are rampant. And you'd have a hard time finding anybody who'd be gullible enough to believe that any of this stuff is actually real. Well, everybody's falling for fake AI content, so I guess each generation has their own spontaneous lobotomies. Anyway, what I'm trying to get at here is the fact that what we're afraid of changes drastically through time. It's just the natural process of technological evolution and our getting used to it. Now we have SFX artists explaining to us how all of this movie magic works, and we're generally just more familiar with it by sheer exposure. But it's not just the visual side of things that needs to change, it goes deeper than that, down to the thematic level. The concepts themselves need to evolve in time for us to find them gripping. At a stage where society is still mostly superstitious, things like witches, devils, and curses would be quite spooky by themselves, hence the amount of folktales about such things. And this is not to say that the same creatures and imagery can be gripping nowadays, it just means that they will need to be reframed. A good example of this is Robert Eggers' The Witch. Imagine how much less effective the movie would have been if it was just about some spooky witch coming out now and then and being like, hey gods, I'm evil, I'll curse you and fly away on my broom. Instead, the director decided to make it a horror film about superstition itself. What's truly terrifying in this movie is the tragedy of blind belief in both societal and domestic oppression. It's the idea of being unjustly accused of crimes that one hasn't committed, and being powerless to defend oneself in any way, of being looked at with distrust and horror by one's own family, the very people who are supposed to be there for love and support. Now, the genius thing about it is also the fact that, well, there are also actual demonic powers at play, but these two aspects of the plot aren't at odds with each other. In fact, they only serve to enhance one another. If it wasn't for blind belief and superstition, this family would have probably not ended up in the hands of the evil that lurks in the forest. Well, one could say that these dark forces are actually the ones messing with everybody's minds and leave it at that, but I find that to be the most banal interpretation of it. So you can see how, reframed in this fashion, the theme can be effective for a contemporary audience. But in a few decades, who knows if it will still resonate. I've dragged The Witch into this just to point out how whenever I'll be talking about a trend or concept becoming less effective or dying off, I won't be talking in absolutes. Any concept can be spun into something horrifying by a skilled artist. But some kind of reframing will be necessary most of the time to make it appetizing for newer audiences. Now, this also ties well into a trend we can observe the expansion of throughout the last 50 years more or less. The psychologization of horror. As our cities grow and become more illuminated, and the wilderness around them shrinks and its fauna becomes extinct, thanks progress, the places that scare us shift too. I think that as we, so to speak, conquer the natural space around us, wild animals and the more mysterious things that go bump in the night become less and less spooky, to the point where they often just turn into cool mascots. What we also start realizing at that point is that what might be scarier are actually the crazy, violent, or otherwise dangerous people we might encounter. And so we start having movies like Psycho, and later the whole slasher trend, in which a psychologically unstable and dangerous individual would start randomly murdering innocent people, with all the misrepresentation of mental illnesses that all of this very sadly implied. But I feel that the effectiveness of this movement waned quite quickly, as we became more and more exposed to violent and gory media and got used to it. If you watch Halloween nowadays, you'll be surprised at how tame and even comical this trend-setting movie is, while back in the day it probably shivered more than a few timbers. So soon enough, film writers and directors realized that maybe the most effective use of psychological horror was to actually center it around the protagonists. The revelation struck them that if the main character is more fleshed out, then people will empathize more with them and so become more scared of the horrors that they face. Obviously, nowadays anything gets called psychological horror, and I think that it's just because this trend has become so ingrained in the genre that the term is now primarily a way to distinguish films that go a little bit deeper from the usual schlock that gets pumped out to make a quick buck with the most generic and uninteresting character writing you've ever seen. The point here is that human beings are complex, and our psychology is a well of nigh infinite depth ripe for exploration, both in its ugliness and its beauty. To bring it back to the spatial level, this is what I call the absolute interior. Our psyche as the innermost part of what we can explore. So now, what about the absolute exterior? This might seem like a stretch, but hear me out. One of the main thematic areas in which the changes in our tastes and fears seem very clear is space and aliens. Science fiction set in space had a very big rise in the second half of the 20th century, and the genre of horror wanted a piece of that pie. The universe is inherently mysterious, so just as our psyche, it provides an infinite reservoir of ideas. It's also inherently terrifying, being probably the least human-friendly place ever, and it's literally all around us, forever, unknown, unending, unreal, unearthed. And it was already terrifying enough in something like the original Alien, one of the best films ever made with one of the greatest taglines ever written: "In space, no one can hear you scream." But directors also started to tap into its more incomprehensible aspects, with the obligatory earlier example of Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, but also much more recent examples like Contact, Interstellar, Arrival, or High Life. Although none of these are really horror movies per se. A lot of actual horror that deals with space in some way focuses more on hostile alien life. This trend was still going strong during the 2000s, with films like Signs and The Fourth Kind garnering a lot of popularity at the time, and as I've already mentioned, especially with all the TV shows covering alien-related stuff. Maybe it's just me, but I feel like both the horror and the wonder that stories set in space would conjure have really died down. Alien stuff feels to me kinda lame and mundane nowadays. To me, it feels like that sense of wonder and excitement towards outer space really waned at the end of the 90s to early 2000s. So my question now is, when and why did this mundanity set in? And did it happen in all types of media? Isn't it crazy that we can kinda get used to something as vast and terrifying as space and the mysteries it contains? Well, obviously there's no clear-cut answer, but I have my own theory for this. Our perception of the world is inherently informed by the different types of mediums we interface with. This can lead to the boundaries of our world becoming less and less clear. The thing is that while we used to learn about the world and how it works and what's beyond it before, all the mediums that would show it to us were low intensity. We don't interact directly with movies and books. We are always put in front of them, which inherently creates some detachment. On the other hand, one medium where space exploration never seemed to die down, but on the contrary appeared to grow, is video games. As video games evolved and expanded, things inevitably changed. Suddenly we had a medium that put us in the driver's seat. We were the ones interacting with these spaces and worlds. We were the explorers. And yeah, of course at first they were also low intensity. I mean, look at this. But just in the span of a few years we got stuff like this. And look at where we are now. It's pretty insane if you stop and think about it. We are at a point where we can actually simulate space's infinity through generative maps in a high-fidelity environment. And I think that we realized that maybe it's kind of boring. Not the games, don't get me wrong, I mean just space itself. Before it might have been like, ooh, what's hiding behind that planet in our solar system? Ooh, maybe it's an alien? Ooh, so mysterious. And now, many of us know that, yeah, you could travel for decades at an incredible speed and you wouldn't even reach anything, because it's all mostly empty. and if we reach some planet, it's gonna be either a ball of ice or a ball of toxic gases, and again, completely empty. Not very thrilling. Our understanding and knowledge of space has expanded so much that the wonder for it, for the average person, has inevitably waned. Of course, I don't want to sound too cynical, it's all still very much fascinating in my opinion, it just doesn't seem to give that same intense sense of excitement as it used to. We've been virtually exploring it for years, so it's just not as novel to us anymore. And look at aliens too, we've had so many dang versions of them, from little grey men to weird tentacled things to hot blue mamas to clouds to 16th dimensional incomprehensible conceptual lyrical spiritual miracles. I feel like we've kinda seen it all. An obvious big problem both with space stuff and psychological stuff is also the limit of our own imagination. As the world of art becomes more and more saturated, it becomes harder and harder to come up with something new and original. And so, too often, when a new film or a game comes out, it feels like we've already seen it or many of the ideas therein. It's not an impossible feat to find a new big thing, just look at how huge of a trend analog horror has become. Sure, it might often show us concepts we're somewhat familiar with, but it did put forward a new format of storytelling, which reframes all of its contents in a seemingly more original way. But even in this case, it doesn't take a lot of brainpower to see how it, too, has become oversaturated. So, even in a well of seemingly infinite potential, our imagination has its limits. And it rings true both for the absolute exterior of space and the absolute interior of the psyche. This is why I wanted to touch on the Backrooms, because I think that they jolted the horror genre awake with something completely different, even if only for a while. So, to tie all of it together, let's finally bring it back to the Backrooms. One of my questions was, where are the Backrooms? I'd propose that they're somewhere at the intersection between the exterior and the interior, but not exactly, more so off-center. Just like space and psychology, they appear as a well of infinite possibilities, limited only by our imagination, but they are morphologically completely different. Space is, maybe, infinite and mysterious, yes, but we could someday technically get on a spaceship and explore the whole thing, and even now we feel like we know so much about it that it's become predictable. The mind is, maybe, also infinite and mysterious, and we obviously can't physically explore it, but we can do so through words and emotions. The Backrooms appear to be infinite and explorable too, but in a distinct way. First of all, to tie this back to the whole mediums inform our perception of the world, look no further than the Backrooms. The whole concept comes from video games, from the act of clipping through the solid map of the world prepared by the developers and going out of bounds, seeing what's behind it, seeing what makes it tick. And technically, they are somewhat real, just not in the physical world. The out of bounds is explorable, it is something we can see, just virtually. But again, the whole thing about boundaries falling and mediums becoming more and more immersive, we could get to a point where we cannot distinguish the real from the virtual anymore, so that's something to keep in mind. The Backrooms play an interesting trick on both our relationship with physical space and with our psyche. They're like a version of outer space itself, but informed by human memories. As you all know, one of the things that characterizes them is how empty they are. But that's not exactly right, is it? They're not as empty as the black void of the cosmos. In fact, they're very much filled with stuff. Specifically stuff that is familiar to us humans. Stairs, walls, hallways, wallpaper, tiles, pools, glass panes, steel banisters, furniture, houses, roads, etc. The amazing trick they play consists in the constant tension between familiar and alien. Because while all of this stuff is recognizable, it is always placed in ways which make absolutely no sense for us. Hallways and rooms seem to connect to each other randomly, coiling into maze-like structures. Doors and stairs sometimes lead to nowhere. Objects and furniture are placed around with no real logic. Proportions go from vaguely ergonomic to impossibly titanic, etc. It's as if some great alien mind has observed the spaces we inhabit and tried to recreate them without an understanding of their use. Or as if these places were the projection of our own collective mind slowly failing and just making random connections in its hole-filled memory. And I'm sure that there are many theories out there as to why or how the Backrooms came to be, but I'm really not interested in an explanation. With every new lore addition, they become smaller and less mysterious. As always, the lack of originality and the ease of access to the means of production quickly end up oversaturating and bringing down the general quality of a horror trend, but that's just par for the course. At their core, though, the Backrooms are still absolutely fascinating. and I've mentioned games like Pools and Liminalcore, but I'd add to that at least Dreamcore and The Complex, because they simply give you a chance to explore these spaces without the needless fluff like monster chases. The act of going through these rooms and having your logical expectations constantly subverted is already enough to make you feel uneasy. More than that, they obviously play into that strange feeling which liminal photography gives us too. While being very uncanny, they also often somehow feel cozy. Most of you have probably seen one or more representations of the Backrooms that you would definitely want to experience in real life. For me, it would probably be the one with the skyscraper corridors filled with grass and flowers and surrounded by clouds. I refuse to separate them into levels because I find it dangerously lame. Or the more famous pool rooms. It's a strange thing, but just like some liminal spaces can harken back to our childhood memories by showing us schools, malls, or playgrounds, the same can happen with the Backrooms. Personally, I know why the pool rooms work so well for me. I used to regularly go to swimming lessons as a kid, and generally loved swimming pools. At one point, I even used to live in a building that had one, which I did sometimes get down to in the evenings. But as you can imagine, being a little kid, I both loved it and was scared of it at the same time. You see, there was never anyone there, and so on the one side I had a big watery playground all for myself. On the other, I sometimes got the feeling that I wasn't alone and became suddenly randomly quite spooked. For some reason I had this recurring fear that sharks would suddenly appear in the pool. I don't know, don't ask, I was like 9 years old, alright? Anyway, the consequence is that nowadays I'm morbidly fascinated by swimming pools, especially at night. And anytime I smell chlorine, a wave of calmness and nostalgia washes over me. So when I see a space like this, it plays on my childish memories, as you can guess. And it gives me a similar sense of peace and comfiness, while still somehow managing to make me feel uneasy, just like that one real pool as a kid. And everyone will probably have their own similar experience with this whole Backrooms liminal space phenomenon. It seems to really tie together the vastness and otherness of outer space and that familiarity of human memory and psychology, while changing them into something new. It also, again, offers an immense reservoir of possibilities to any artist with enough imagination, and the loose boundaries of its structure allow for breathtaking and surprising switch-ups. One of my favorite moments in all of KMPixel's work has to be this part of found footage number 3, where the protagonist is running through what looks like a generic office building, to then suddenly get to a windowed walkway which allows him to see the outside, completely cluttered by huge densely packed buildings. I live for that shit. The man could just make a regular series of explorations into his version of the Backrooms with no plot whatsoever, and I'd still be hooked for every second. If we had to put it a bit differently, I'd say that the Backrooms offer the infinite possibilities and vastness of outer space while dressing it in something that is not necessarily harsh or dangerous to us, and that we can make at least some sense of. So to finish up with how the Backrooms trend relates to our perception of horror and to guess what will come after it, I need to talk about how original concepts in media are created. This is obviously all my own way of looking at it, so take it with a grain of salt. I would propose that there are fundamentally 3 main ways in which people come up with new stuff in art, and all 3 lead to different results. I would call these dissection, combination, and creation. To put it simply, dissection would be the process of digging as much as possible in already existing concepts that have been used before, until you find a very specific area that has either never been touched or has, but only by a few people. So basically, it's like continuously dividing up a concept into smaller parts until you reach something that feels new. One great result of this is that you might start paying attention to completely overlooked aspects of a piece of art. To give you an example, this is basically what a creator like Annie Austin does by turning his gaze to environmental stuff in gaming which most of us usually pay no mind to. Then, combination is exactly what it sounds like. You combine 2 or more already known concepts until you find something that works. Maybe you think, horror game and driving game. Boom, you got Beware. You take cat, you take dog, you put them together and you get cat dog. Whatever. The third and last way is creation, which kinda means everything and nothing at the same time. I feel that sometimes, though rarely, it is possible for somebody to just come up with something super original without necessarily basing it off something else. Now, of course, nothing comes out of nothing, so there will be some influences at play, but a few rare artists can just make art so unique that you'd have a hard time comparing it to anybody else. The first example that comes to my mind is a musician, Colin Stetson. People have been playing saxophone for quite a long time, but nobody did it like him. Others I'd put in a similar category would maybe be Tim Hacker, Longfin Killy, Onion3x Point Never, Cloud Dead, whatever, you get the point. It's something that feels completely different. The problem nowadays, I think, with the hypersaturation of art is that it's getting harder and harder to come up with something unique. Most people use the first two ways, which is not a bad thing at all, but it does make me sometimes feel like we're so starved for new content that we have to look at the most specific and strange facets of already existing stuff, which I'm also proudly guilty of, to be fair. But be it for the fact that we're all overstimulated with content and have little time to just get bored and come up with something new, or that so much stuff has already been made that it's just hard to find something that's never been done before, the third way of creation seems even more rare now. But I don't know, that's just something to think about, I guess. Anyway, where would the Backrooms fall in these three approaches? Well, the idea of that one original poster seems like a combination kind of situation. He took a concept from video games and applied it to real life. Simple enough. Though what this whole phenomenon became makes me tilt more so towards creation. Because the specific feeling that these liminal space pictures and games evoke is absolutely contemporary. While the fascination with emptiness and liminality might have existed a long time ago, just look at Piero della Francesca or more recently Mario Sironi and the Chirico, it has been completely reframed with the advent of the internet and video games. And what I think it shows us about horror in general might be the fact that we kinda got used to most of those big themes from before, and we feel the need for something new and different. Hence the proliferation of all the different trends that are fundamentally tied to generation born into the internet or video game era, like the Backrooms themselves. But as I said, it's already starting to feel a bit overused, so it's inevitable to think about what's coming next. There are definitely already some identifiable contemporary trends like the reframing of more or less recent history through a new and warped lens, which is something we can, again, see with Kane Pixel's work and with a series like The Oldest View, or in stuff like the Monument Mythos, or our growing fascination with lost media too. But the latest big frontier, for better or for worse, is undeniably artificial intelligence. And here I'm not even talking about the cool uses of AI, which, yes, do exist, even if they still always feel like kind of a cop-out. I'm talking about the absolutely dog-water levels of AI-generated videos. The ones where a random subject becomes completely morphed in ways that make no sense at all, in which nothing flows in any humanly recognizable way. It transforms even the simplest stuff into nightmare fuel. The fascination with this trend, I think, is pretty obvious. AI does stuff that appears completely unexpected for us. It manages to surprise us through its calculated randomness. Many of us still make the mistake of looking at it as an actual mind coming up with weird things, but there's no actual reasoning behind it. And I'm absolutely not saying that newer horror will be made with AI and that that's gonna stick. But I do expect a lot of artists to take inspiration from its very recognizable style of randomness. And once again, there is a rationale here. On the one hand, I think that all of these sloppy and surreal AI videos remind us of our own dreams, where stuff suddenly changes shape and moves with no rhyme or logic. On the other, there's also that whole thing about hypersaturation and difficulty of coming up with new stuff that puts more pressure on looking for it in such avenues. I think that this kind of brainless slop, in a way, reflects the current artistic crisis we're facing, and might appear, for some, even liberating. I don't want this to sound too bleak. What you have to keep in mind, at least in the context of art, is that without a crisis there's no evolution. The whole history of all major forms of art has always been that of a tradition becoming saturated to the point of a general creative crisis, in the face of which we get new avant-garde movements, which after a while become themselves tradition, which leads to a crisis and rinse and repeat the whole process. What might make it all so confusing today is that in such a fast-paced world, the whole loop seems to constantly be happening all at once. But I think that's just something we'll need to learn how to contend with as time moves on. So I hope at least some of this made sense to you. If you disagree, I encourage you to share your point of view in the comments, because it's especially on this kind of stuff that some dialogue is needed. I was trying to write this video for months now, and this is like the 5th rewrite. At some point I just told myself that if I kept doing this, I would never finish it. I'm not sure I'm happy with how it turned out, but I wanted to be done with it so it doesn't haunt me anymore. I hope you find the end result somewhat decent and interesting. As always, I want to thank all of you for watching my stupid little videos, and see you space places.